Welcome. Thank you for joining me again as we walk through the book of Acts. We got an exciting story today. Paul gets picked up in the temple and gets arrested by the Romans, which is good because the Jews were trying to kill him. So let's get a little context here. We're in the middle of the story. You remember Paul came to Jerusalem to bring an offering to the elders of the church for the famine that was going on in that area. And the elders encouraged him to take a vow in the temple to prove that he wasn't teaching against the law or against Moses or encouraging Jews to quit following the law. And so he was in the middle of that, trying to dispel these rumors and the temple with these other Christians who were taking a Jewish vow as well, when some people noticed him. The Christian Jews seemed to accept this. The Christian Jews seemed to appreciate that Paul was following the law and being a Christian at the same time. But as the text tells us, some Jews from Asia Minor, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid their hands on him. And it was just a mob riot. It was chaos. They claimed he brought in a Gentile into the temple, which was completely against the law. It would defile the temple. And the crowd just went berserk. The mob laid their hands on him and were planning to do him harm. And that's where we pick up the text this morning. As they were seeking to kill him, the word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. He at once took the soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. As Paul was about to be brought to the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek? Are you not the Egyptian then, who recently stirred up a revolt and led 4,000 men of assassins out into the wilderness?" Paul replied, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Sicily, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, "Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you." And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Sicily, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God as all of you this day. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed towards Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. As I was on my way and drew near to Damascus, about noon a great light from heaven suddenly shone all around me. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And I answered, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said to me, 'I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting.' Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, 'What shall I do, Lord?' And the Lord said to me, 'Rise and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that is appointed for you to do.' And since I could not see because of the brightness of the light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me, and came into Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me, and standing by me, said to me, 'Brother Saul, receive your sight.' And at that very hour I received my sight and saw him. And he said, 'The God of our fathers has appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one and to hear the voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard.' And now why do you wait? Rise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. It's quite a scene. You have the temple courts. They dragged Paul out of the temple area. Fortunately, the Roman soldiers were garrisoned right there next to the temple. And when the crowd went crazy, the Romans were able to come down into the crowd. You almost wonder if there weren't some Jewish Christians that joined the mob. I have a feeling there were still some Jewish Christians who didn't like Paul and what he was teaching. But nonetheless, there were certainly some Jews from Asia Minor who were not Christians, who stirred up the crowd and were hoping to beat him to death. But he speaks in Aramaic, or the text says the Hebrew language, but Aramaic was the sort of a derivative of Hebrew. And when he starts speaking in their language, the crowd quiets down. He identifies himself as one of them and not a Greek speaker, even though Paul probably knew several languages. Paul doesn't give a theological treatise, and I find this very interesting as we look through here. How is Paul going to present the gospel? He doesn't give them a big theological treatise. He doesn't argue from the law of Moses that Jesus is the one like Moses, as was prophesied. He doesn't quote from any of the prophets regarding the prophecies about the Messiah to come. Paul doesn't choose any of these avenues, even though he's very familiar with those texts and those scriptures. So what does Paul do in a situation like this? He simply tells his story. He starts out, and I imagine he told it many, many times. I was on the road to Damascus. And this story has become so famous that even people that aren't familiar with the Bible talk about Damascus Road experiences. That's actually become a saying in English. But it all goes back to Paul telling his story. I was on the road to Damascus. You wonder how many times the brothers who traveled with him had heard that story, that all he had to do was start that phrase off, and they would be familiar with him telling his story about being on the road to Damascus, about going there to kill Christians, when suddenly a bright light appears to him. Paul doesn't fall back on all of his education. He falls back on his personal experience with the Lord Jesus Christ. And you remember they're all claiming, this crowd that's yelling at him are claiming that he teaches against the law and against the temple, that he's teaching the Jews who live outside of Israel that they don't need to follow the law anymore, which is not true. If you read through Acts, you can tell that Paul never teaches that. But it's also interesting that these are the same accusations that many in this same mob said about Jesus. Certainly the elders and the high priest, the Sanhedrin, would have been familiar that these are the same accusations that were being said, that 20 years earlier probably had been said about Jesus, and they were saying the same things about Paul. They had to wonder, will we ever get rid of this teaching? Paul's story emphasizes his Jewishness. He's pointing out, I haven't left the faith. I haven't become an apostate. I'm not rejecting the religion of my forefathers. And in fact, I'm actually completely faithful to the religion, the theology of our forefathers. I am faithful to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, just like all those Jews who were trying to kill him were claiming. Now you wonder, why does Paul tell his story? Well, it's one of those things. They all knew Paul. Paul had quite the reputation. He had become quite famous or infamous, depending on which side of the argument you were on. They didn't like him, but they definitely knew who he was. His story was an interesting one. Everyone knew that there was this great persecutor of the way of Christianity, and that he had switched sides. They sent him to Damascus to bring back Christians in chains. He came back as a Christian, a slave of Christ. And that kind of had an impact. And hearing it from his own lips was probably something that even those who didn't like him wanted to hear. What was it that changed your mind, Paul? What changed you from being a persecutor to a follower of Christ, an advocate for Christianity? He was famous for his zeal for the law, and he was famous about persecuting Christians. Why would you switch? That had to be on the minds of everyone who knew about him. And he was quite famous. Almost everybody knew about him. And the fact that he was now a Christian, I mean, that had to have been a shock. That had to have been a question mark that they all wanted an explanation of. Whether they agreed with him or not, they would want to know why. Why would you, who persecuted the church, now become a great advocate for it? The thing is, his story had a mass appeal. Everyone who knew him knew his story, and they would have been interested. For him to tell his story would have been something that would have stuck with the crowd. Those who were listening would want to know, and they'd want to say, hey, I heard it from Paul himself. He told his story because everyone knew part of his story and wanted to get the rest of the story. He emphasized that he was not rejecting the law of Moses. This was the accusation against him, that he was not defiling the temple. But he actually says, I'm being more faithful to the scriptures, to the text. You remember the early church, the church of the first century, taught the gospel out of the Old Testament scriptures. They weren't rejecting them. They were using them, and Paul made a good explanation that he was being consistent with their faith, not going against it. He was doing fine with the crowd. I think he was maybe getting through the fact that they had all calmed down and were listening. I think he was doing quite well until he got to the part about God sending him to the Gentiles. I think that was just a little too much, because one of the things they did know was that he was teaching and preaching and converting many Gentiles into Christianity, but he was not converting them into Judaism. And that had been a clash in the church. If you remember back in Acts 15, the church had to come together and work out that problem. Do you have to become a Jew in order to become a Christian? And the answer was no. But to the Jews, you can't be faithful to God and not have to become a Jew. And so when Paul got to that point, mayhem broke out again, and the Romans had to get him out of there before the crowds killed him. So what's this story for us? What do we get out of this? How does hearing Paul tell his story and barely escape a mob affect us today? How do we work that into our lives? Well, let's look at that for a moment. Paul lived a faith that demanded an explanation. You have to admit, if someone was out trying to kill Christians and then suddenly became one, you'd kind of be curious. You'd want to know why. You'd want to hear that story. He lived a life that demanded an explanation. And we need to understand Paul told his story because they knew him. He had a relationship with him. He had a reputation. Well, now in these modern days, those of us who claim to be followers of Christ, we too have a reputation. We too are known by our coworkers, by our friends, by our neighbors. We're the ones, we have credibility with those people that we interact with on a regular basis. And so I think it's important that when they talk to us about our faith, or we bring it up, that it's based on them observing our lives. We have a relationship, and that's what gives us the credibility. They know us, they see our lives, they observe our character. And I have a feeling sometimes people don't want to share their faith because they know this very fact. They recognize they may not actually behave like a Christian should, and therefore don't want to identify themselves as Christians. But the fact of the matter is, our lives are the most powerful sermon we have. The words that come out of our mouth, our business ethics, the way we treat people. I loved Francis of Assisi talked about we need to preach everywhere we go, and when necessary, use words. He was making the point that it's our very lives that actually preach the best sermon, that give us the credibility to share our story with those who don't know Jesus. So our call to action, we need to live lives. We need to live a faith that demands an explanation. We need to live in such a way that people say, why do you do that? Why are you so generous with your time, why are you always so encouraging? Why do you give people the benefit of the doubt? Why are you filled with so much mercy and grace? And when those people ask us those questions, then we can tell our story, how Jesus has affected my life. Because that's what people are truly interested in. They might have a few theological questions. They might want an explanation of the scriptures and how Jesus came to be and why he had to die for our sins. But initially, what's going to draw the world to Christ is when the world sees Christ in his followers, in us. When we live a faith that demands an explanation, and then they will ask us, tell me your story so that I too can become a follower of Jesus Christ. Thank you for joining me.